Let me begin with something that may completely change the way you are looking at this war, because there is a strong possibility that many of us, myself included, have been focusing on the wrong part of the conflict. Not because we lack information or because we are unable to understand what is happening, but because the way modern wars are presented to the public often directs attention toward the most visible events while hiding the deeper structure underneath. We see the explosions, the missiles crossing the sky, the military statements, the headlines about oil and shipping lanes, but beneath all of those events is a much larger strategic framework that explains why this conflict has reached a point where the world's most powerful military is struggling to produce a clear outcome. So today, I want to move beyond the surface. I want to examine the hidden architecture behind this confrontation, the strategic logic driving both sides, and the factors that explain why this war has entered a dangerous state where neither peace nor a decisive victory appears within reach. And by the end of this analysis, I will outline 3 specific predictions about what could happen next, along with the signals you can watch yourself to determine whether those predictions are becoming reality. But before we look ahead, we need to start with what happened yesterday morning, because that moment revealed something extremely important. The Washington Post published a report based on an internal assessment from multiple United States intelligence agencies, and the source of this information matters. This was not simply a statement from one frustrated official or an anonymous comment from someone inside the government. According to the report, this represented a coordinated intelligence assessment circulated among senior levels of the American national security system. The conclusion from U.S. intelligence was a phrase that deserves attention. The United States and Iran are trapped in an indefinite limbo between peace and war. Those words are significant. To understand why, we need to look at the situation surrounding them. The United States had just completed the 11th consecutive night of air operations against Iran, 11 straight nights of strikes without interruption. According to figures presented by Defense Secretary Pete Hoekstra during testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee, the United States had already spent approximately $37.5 billion on the conflict. During that same testimony, he requested an additional $67.1 billion in funding. Think about that for a moment. Around $37.5 billion already committed, another $67.1 billion being requested, creating a potential cost of more than $100 billion, and this is happening during a conflict that President Trump had previously described as something that would be quick, decisive, and relatively limited in expense. But here is where the contradiction appears. At the exact moment when American aircraft are conducting nightly operations, when missiles are being launched, and when billions of dollars are being spent, American intelligence officials are privately assessing that the conflict has not produced a clear military solution. That raises the central question: how can the most powerful military force on Earth apply overwhelming firepower and still find itself stuck between victory and defeat? The answer requires looking beyond individual strikes and understanding the structure of modern conflict. Before going further, it is important to clarify something. The analysis presented here is based on publicly available information, military statements, economic indicators, and reported assessments. Like any analysis, it can be challenged, and that is exactly how serious strategic discussions should work. The goal is not to simply repeat a narrative, but to examine the evidence, compare competing explanations, and understand the forces shaping events. To understand why this conflict has reached a stalemate, we first need to understand what can be called the mechanical escalation trap. This concept explains a pattern that has appeared in many major conflicts over the past several decades. When a powerful state launches an air campaign against an opponent that has intentionally decentralized its military structure, the attacker faces a difficult paradox. Every successful strike may remove one target, but it can also create new problems because the opposing force adapts, disperses, and changes its methods. The more pressure one side applies, the more the other side is pushed to respond. And once both sides begin escalating, stepping backward becomes politically dangerous. Leaders fear appearing weak. Governments fear losing credibility. Military organizations fear that reducing operations will send the wrong message. The result is a cycle where each action creates another reaction. You launch strikes. The other side responds. You increase the pressure. They increase their response, the list of targets grows, the geographical area expands, the financial cost rises, and gradually the conflict develops a momentum of its own. Former Pentagon official David Desroches described this type of process as a mechanical ratcheting of escalation. The comparison is important because a ratchet moves forward step by step, but it is extremely difficult to move backward once pressure has built. That appears to describe the current position of both the United States and Iran. Both sides have escalated, but neither side has found an easy way to reduce the intensity without risking political damage. Now, let us examine what the United States has actually been doing. U.S. Central Command has conducted multiple consecutive nights of airstrikes targeting what it describes as critical Iranian military infrastructure. These targets reportedly include command facilities, maritime capabilities, radar systems, air defense networks, unmanned aerial vehicle launch sites, and ballistic missile infrastructure in southern Iran. One of the most significant strikes was against the Darkovin nuclear facility in Khuzestan province. Iran had spent years developing this site, and the attack represented a major symbolic and strategic move. But the larger question is not whether these strikes caused damage. They almost certainly did. The question is whether that damage translates into a sustainable strategic advantage. At sea, the United States has also increased pressure around the Strait of Hormuz. The USS Boxer and other naval assets have been involved in operations that affected commercial shipping routes. CENTCOM has stated that it helped provide safe passage for hundreds of commercial vessels carrying hundreds of millions of barrels of oil since operations began. On paper, these actions demonstrate enormous military capability. Airstrikes, naval operations, attacks against infrastructure, and pressure on maritime routes all represent significant force. But military power is not measured only by the size of the attack. It is measured by whether those actions achieve the political objective behind them. And this is where the situation becomes far more complicated. One of the biggest challenges facing the United States is that Iran has spent years restructuring its military system around decentralization. Rather than relying on one single command structure controlled entirely from Tehran, Iran has developed regional networks with independent chains of communication, separate operational capabilities, and the ability to continue functioning even if central leadership facilities are damaged. This creates a major problem for traditional air campaigns. If an opponent depends heavily on one central command structure, destroying that structure can create paralysis. But if the system is designed to absorb attacks and continue operating, then even highly effective strikes may not produce strategic collapse. The United States experienced similar challenges in Iraq and Afghanistan, where removing leadership and destroying infrastructure did not automatically create political stability or eliminate resistance. This is the fundamental difficulty of fighting a decentralized opponent. The question is no longer simply, can you destroy targets? The real question becomes, can you destroy enough of the system to force the other side to accept your political demands? And that is where the conflict between the United States and Iran has become much more complicated. Because while American aircraft have been carrying out strikes, Iran has been following its own strategy at the same time. And understanding that strategy is the key to understanding why this conflict has not produced a clear winner. While the United States was carrying out continuous air operations, Iran was not simply absorbing the attacks and waiting for the next move. Instead, Tehran was following a structured response strategy designed around maintaining pressure, demonstrating capability, and proving that American military superiority does not automatically translate into political control. This is where the conflict becomes strategically interesting. Iran has described its operations using specific names and numbered phases, including what it calls Operation Martyr II and Operation Sadeke. These were not random reactions or isolated attacks carried out without preparation. They were presented as organized military campaigns with planned stages and objectives. During these operations, Iran targeted several American and Allied military positions throughout the region. Reports indicated attacks against facilities in Bahrain, including the CENTCOM data center, Patriot missile systems, and radar installations. In Kuwait, Iranian strikes reportedly targeted Patriot systems and radar equipment at Ali al-Salam Air Base. In Jordan, Iranian missiles reportedly damaged military aircraft at Aqaba Airport, including a C-17 transport aircraft and a P-8 maritime patrol aircraft. The weapons used in these attacks were not simple rockets or inaccurate systems. Iran deployed missiles such as the Khaybar Shikan, Fateh 110, Zolfagar, and Imad ballistic missile systems. These are precision-guided weapons designed to strike military targets with a high degree of accuracy. And one statement from President Trump himself highlighted the seriousness of the situation. Speaking about the attack in Jordan, he acknowledged that Iranian forces had managed to penetrate defenses and stated that with different operators, the outcome might have been different. That admission matters because it challenges the idea that the conflict is moving in only one direction. A country can suffer significant damage and still maintain the ability to strike back. A military can lose infrastructure and still preserve enough capability to continue fighting. And this is exactly the dynamic that makes this conflict difficult to resolve. Now we need to discuss what may be the single most important factor in this entire confrontation. Not the airstrikes, not the missiles, not even the nuclear facilities. The most important factor may be a narrow stretch of water, only about 21 miles wide, at its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz. This waterway is one of the most strategically important maritime routes in the world. A significant portion of global energy exports passes through it every day. Any serious disruption there immediately affects international markets, energy prices, and global economic calculations. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard has issued warnings that while American military pressure continues, exports through the Strait of Hormuz could face severe restrictions. Tehran has made it clear that it views the waterway as a major source of leverage. Recent incidents involving commercial vessels have increased concerns. One tanker was reportedly struck, forcing its crew to abandon the ship, while other vessels experienced explosions or disruptions while attempting to pass through the area. At the same time, CENTCOM has stated that it has helped escort hundreds of commercial ships through the strait. So the question becomes, is Hormuz open or is it effectively closed? The simplest way to examine that question is through the financial markets. Look at oil prices. Brent crude rising above $90 per barrel is not just a number. It represents what global investors believe about future risk. Markets are constantly pricing uncertainty. If traders truly believed the Strait of Hormuz was operating normally, with unrestricted movement of commercial shipping, oil prices would likely be much lower. The fact that prices remain elevated suggests that markets are still calculating a serious possibility of disruption. Markets do not operate based on political speeches. They respond to risk. And the risk being priced into oil is that the Strait of Hormuz remains vulnerable. But the situation becomes even more complicated because Iran's strategy may not depend only on Hormuz. There is another critical maritime point involved: Bab el-Mandeb. This is where a broader strategy begins to appear. Iran's regional partners, particularly the Houthi movement in Yemen, have also increased pressure around the Red Sea route. Bab el-Mandeb acts as an alternative pathway for energy exports when Persian Gulf routes become threatened. If Hormuz becomes dangerous, countries such as Saudi Arabia can attempt to redirect exports through the Red Sea. But if pressure increases at both locations simultaneously, the options become much more limited. This is what creates what can be described as a dual choke point strategy. The first pressure point is the Strait of Hormuz, where a large percentage of globally traded oil passes every day. The second is Bab el-Mandeb, where disruptions can affect shipping between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean through the Suez Canal. If both areas face serious instability, even partially, the consequences could extend far beyond the immediate battlefield. Energy prices could rise, transportation costs could increase, and governments around the world would face economic pressure. This is especially significant politically because domestic economic concerns often influence public opinion during wartime. Energy prices are not just an economic issue, they are a political issue. Governments can survive military criticism. They often struggle when voters feel the direct financial consequences of a conflict. Iran understands this reality, and the timing of these actions matters. Political calendars influence military strategy. Leaders know when elections are approaching, when public attention becomes more sensitive, and when economic pressure becomes more damaging. Now, there is another development from the last 48 hours that deserves attention because it reveals a different battlefield: diplomacy. While the United States continues military operations against Iran, Washington has also been involved in efforts connected to a broader regional agreement involving the United States, Israel, and Lebanon. The proposed framework reportedly involves Israeli withdrawal from certain areas in southern Lebanon and discussions about Hezbollah's future military role. President Trump's meeting with Lebanese President Joseph Aoun during the same period added another layer of significance to these diplomatic efforts. The strategic logic behind this is important. Iran's strongest bargaining tool in negotiations with the United States has never been only its nuclear program. It has also been its regional network of allies, especially Hezbollah. For years, Hezbollah has represented one of Iran's most important forms of influence outside its borders. It gives Tehran strategic depth and creates additional pressure points in any negotiation involving regional security. So if Washington can resolve the Lebanon issue separately, it could reduce Iran's ability to use Hezbollah as leverage during future discussions. From the American perspective, this would be a smart negotiating strategy. Remove one of Iran's strongest cards before entering a larger agreement. However, the fact that such a move is necessary also reveals something important. A side that is achieving a complete military victory usually does not need to carefully manage the opponent's diplomatic options. If victory is clear and unavoidable, negotiations become secondary. The need to address these issues suggests that the conflict is more complicated than a simple story of one side defeating the other. The United States is applying enormous pressure, but Iran continues to maintain enough capability to influence the battlefield and the negotiating table. And this brings us to another important factor: the domestic political pressure inside the United States itself. Because wars are not fought only overseas. They are also fought within the political systems of the countries involved. Inside the United States, the political environment surrounding this conflict has become increasingly complicated. Military campaigns are not determined only by what happens on the battlefield. They are also shaped by public opinion, political pressure, economic realities, and the ability of leaders to maintain support over time. Several American officials have openly questioned whether the current strategy can achieve a meaningful victory. Former National Counterterrorism Center Director Joe Kent has argued that the United States has reached what he described as a strategic dead end and has called for negotiations rather than continued escalation. At the same time, President Trump's approval ratings have become a significant political challenge. Recent polling has shown declining public support, with many Americans expressing concerns about the cost, duration, and direction of the conflict. During Senate hearings, Defense Secretary Pete Hoekstra faced intense questioning from lawmakers who challenged the administration's claims that a resolution was close. Senators pointed out that repeated statements suggesting a deal was imminent had not produced an actual agreement, while the financial demands of the conflict continued to grow. Other lawmakers criticized the administration for requesting billions more for military operations, while domestic priorities such as healthcare, housing, and agricultural support faced funding debates. This does not necessarily mean the United States is losing militarily. A country can maintain overwhelming battlefield capabilities while still facing strategic and political limitations. But it does reveal a difficult reality. Military power alone does not determine the outcome of a conflict. A government must also convince its own population that the costs are justified and that the final objective is achievable. And this is where Iran's strategy becomes even more important. One of the most interesting moves Iran has made involves the diplomatic and legal battle surrounding the strike on the Darkovin facility. After the attack, Iran submitted a formal complaint to the International Atomic Energy Agency and the United Nations Security Council, arguing that the strike represented a threat to global nuclear safety. The response from the IAEA was cautious. The agency stated that no nuclear material was present at the site and that there was no immediate evidence of a radiological danger. Russia, however, criticized the response and accused international institutions of ignoring what it described as attacks against Iran. At first glance, this exchange may appear like a simple diplomatic argument, but strategically, Iran may have been trying to achieve something much larger. The objective may not have been to convince the IAEA to stop American military operations. Tehran understands that international organizations have limited ability to directly influence a military campaign. Instead, Iran may have been trying to build a legal and political argument that the IAEA is not a neutral institution. Why does this matter? Because any future agreement involving Iran's nuclear program would likely depend heavily on verification mechanisms. International inspections are usually considered the foundation of confidence building between countries. If Iran can successfully argue that the inspection system is politically biased, it gains an argument for reducing or removing those requirements in future negotiations. This is a long-term diplomatic strategy. The sequence is important. First, a nuclear-related facility is attacked. Second, Iran argues that international institutions failed to respond appropriately. Third, Russia supports that argument. The result is a narrative that weakens trust in international monitoring systems. Iran has also taken domestic steps to restrict future inspections, requiring additional approval before certain inspection activities can take place. Whether this strategy succeeds remains uncertain, but the logic behind it is clear. Iran is trying to strengthen its negotiating position before any serious diplomatic process begins. Now, before reaching a conclusion, it is important to examine the strongest argument from the opposite side. A serious analysis should not only look at evidence supporting one position, it should also consider the strongest possible case against it. So, what is the argument that the United States is actually winning? Supporters of the American strategy point to several important facts. First, the United States has inflicted significant damage on Iranian military infrastructure. The scale and precision of American operations are unlike anything Iran has faced before. Second, Iran has lost senior military personnel, creating potential problems within its command structure. Third, Iranian officials themselves have acknowledged severe economic pressure, including extremely high inflation rates that create domestic challenges. Fourth, CENTCOM maintains that hundreds of commercial ships have continued to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, suggesting that American naval operations have successfully protected international shipping. Finally, supporters argue that no country can fight indefinitely against the world's most powerful military without eventually facing unbearable pressure. According to this argument, Iran may eventually be forced to compromise because economic damage, military losses, and internal frustration will accumulate over time. This is not an irrational argument. There are real elements supporting it. Iran has suffered damage. The United States has enormous military advantages. Economic pressure is real. However, there are several major questions this argument struggles to answer. The first concerns Iran's missile capabilities. Reports from military analysts and satellite imagery assessments suggest that Iran has been able to restore parts of its ballistic missile capacity even after American and Israeli strikes. This is a critical point. If the strikes were completely destroying Iran's offensive capabilities, we would expect to see a significant decline in missile launches over time. We would expect reduced frequency, reduced accuracy, and reduced operational ability. But that has not clearly happened. Iran has continued conducting missile operations. That does not mean Iran has unlimited capability. It does not mean Iran has suffered no damage, but it suggests that the assumption of rapid military collapse may not match the available evidence. The second issue is the contradiction between official statements about maritime security and the behavior of global markets. The United States says commercial shipping continues through Hormuz. The oil market continues to price serious risk. Both cannot be completely true at the same time. If the strait is functioning normally, oil prices should reflect reduced uncertainty. If prices remain elevated, markets are signaling that significant risk remains. The third issue is financial. If the United States is moving toward a clear victory, why does the conflict require tens of billions of additional dollars? The original expectation was that the campaign would be fast and decisive, but the longer the conflict continues, the more difficult it becomes to explain the rising costs. This is the central problem with the idea that Iran will simply collapse under pressure. The assumption is that Iran views the war primarily through economic calculations, but history suggests Iran views survival through a different lens. To understand why Tehran may continue resisting despite enormous pressure, we need to examine the historical lessons that have shaped Iranian decision-making. One of the most important examples comes from ancient history, the Melian dialogue recorded by the Greek historian Thucydides. During the Peloponnesian War, Athens demanded that the island of Melos surrender, arguing that power determines outcomes. The Athenians famously argued that the strong do what they can, while the weak suffer what they must. The people of Melos believed moral arguments, neutrality, and fairness would protect them. They were wrong. Athens destroyed the city, killed the adult men, and enslaved the remaining population. Iranian leaders have studied historical examples like this. They have also watched more recent events. They saw Muammar Gaddafi abandon parts of Libya's weapons program and later lose power after Western intervention. They saw the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani by a U.S. drone strike in Baghdad. They saw the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And from these events, Tehran developed one central conclusion. Survival does not necessarily require defeating a stronger opponent. Sometimes, survival means making the cost of defeating you so high that your opponent decides victory is not worth pursuing. This philosophy explains much of Iran's military strategy. Iran's military strategy has never been built around matching the United States weapon for weapon. Tehran understands that it cannot compete with American air power, naval strength, or technological resources in a traditional military contest. Instead, Iran has focused on creating a system designed to make any attempt to defeat it extremely costly and politically difficult. This is why Iran has invested heavily in asymmetric warfare. Take the example of the Shahed drone program. These drones are relatively inexpensive compared to the advanced weapons systems used to intercept them. The logic behind this strategy is not simply to destroy enemy equipment. It is to create an economic imbalance where the cost of defending against attacks becomes much higher than the cost of launching them. If a relatively inexpensive drone forces an opponent to use a missile that costs many times more, the attacker creates financial pressure even without achieving a traditional battlefield victory. This is a strategy based on endurance. Iran has also invested heavily in underground military infrastructure, particularly in locations designed to survive air attacks. Facilities built into mountains and hardened underground positions are meant to reduce the effectiveness of traditional bombing campaigns. The purpose is not to become invulnerable. The purpose is to ensure that even a massive military campaign cannot quickly eliminate Iran's ability to respond. This explains why Iranian leadership can continue resisting despite economic pressure and domestic difficulties. From Tehran's perspective, surrender carries its own risks. Iranian leaders look at examples like Libya and conclude that abandoning strategic capabilities does not necessarily guarantee security. They believe that weakness can invite further pressure rather than create protection. So, from their perspective, continuing the struggle may appear less dangerous than accepting a deal that leaves them vulnerable. This does not mean Iran is guaranteed to succeed. It means Iran is making a calculation based on its own historical experiences. Now, let us turn to another major issue: the threat against Iran's underground nuclear facility near Isfahan, often referred to as Pickaxe Mountain. President Trump has publicly suggested that the United States could strike this hardened underground location in the future. The statement created significant attention because such a facility represents one of Iran's most protected strategic assets. However, the question is whether this threat represents an actual operational plan or whether it is primarily a tool of pressure and negotiation. There are several reasons to believe it may be more about leverage than an immediate military decision. The first factor is geography. The facility is located deep inside a mountain structure, rather than beneath ordinary soil. Even the United States' most powerful conventional bunker-penetrating weapons may not guarantee complete destruction of such a target. A strike against a deeply buried facility is not the same as attacking a visible surface structure. It requires accurate intelligence, specialized weapons, and confidence that the expected result justifies the risk. The second issue is intelligence uncertainty. President Trump himself has indicated that such an operation would depend on knowing what is actually inside the facility. That point is important. A military strike against a nuclear-related site requires extremely reliable intelligence. If there is uncertainty about the presence of nuclear material or the exact purpose of the facility, the risks increase dramatically. The third factor is logistics. Major military operations require resources, ammunition, aircraft availability, and sustained capability. Reports have suggested that the United States military is already dealing with significant demands from ongoing operations. Planning an additional strike against one of the world's most difficult targets would require careful preparation and resources. The fourth issue is retaliation. Iran has repeatedly warned that an attack on its nuclear infrastructure would expand the conflict across the region. The credibility of that threat cannot simply be ignored. Iran has already demonstrated the ability to strike American positions in multiple countries, including Bahrain, Kuwait, and Jordan. Whether Iran could sustain a larger regional conflict is another question, but its ability to create immediate costs is clear. The fifth factor is international consequences. A strike against nuclear infrastructure carries risks far beyond the battlefield. Even without a major nuclear accident, the political consequences could be enormous. Russia, China, and European governments have expressed concerns about the possibility of a broader crisis if nuclear facilities become targets. For these reasons, the threat against Pickaxe Mountain appears more likely to function as a pressure tool rather than an immediate military operation. The United States wants Iran to understand that certain options remain available, but possessing an option does not mean using it. This distinction is important in strategic analysis. Before making predictions about what comes next, we need to step back and understand the larger pattern behind great power conflicts. If we only focus on individual events, we will constantly be surprised. But if we understand the structure creating those events, future developments become easier to anticipate. One of the most important ideas in international relations comes from Hans Morgenthau, one of the founders of modern realism. Morgenthau argued that powerful states often present their strategic interests through moral language. In simple terms, countries frequently explain their actions using principles such as security, justice, freedom, or protection, while underneath those explanations are deeper calculations about influence and power. This does not mean every stated reason is false. It means national interests and moral arguments often exist together. The Iran conflict demonstrates this clearly. The United States argues that its actions are designed to protect freedom of navigation and prevent nuclear proliferation. Those arguments have strategic value, but critics point out contradictions. For example, Washington says it is defending maritime security while simultaneously applying economic pressure on Iranian shipping networks. Washington says it is preventing nuclear risks while also expanding nuclear cooperation with regional partners. From this perspective, opponents argue that the policy is not only about non-proliferation but also about maintaining strategic influence in the region. At the same time, Iran follows a similar pattern. Tehran presents its regional strategy through the language of resistance against foreign intervention. The United States presents its actions through the language of security and stability. Both sides have narratives designed to justify their actions. The important analytical skill is separating the public explanation from the underlying strategic objective. Once you learn to identify the difference between political messaging and strategic interest, international conflicts become easier to understand. Now, with that framework in mind, we can move toward the most important question: what happens next? The following predictions are not claims of certainty. They are specific possibilities based on current evidence, and they can be tested over time. The first prediction concerns diplomacy. The United States, Iran, Pakistan, and Qatar are likely to continue exploring negotiations, but the first rounds of diplomacy are unlikely to produce a final agreement. Iran has already begun using multiple channels of communication. Iranian officials have engaged with Pakistan's leadership, while Qatar continues to play a role as a possible intermediary. The framework for discussions exists. However, the gap between American demands and what Iran can realistically accept remains extremely large. Washington wants strict limits on enrichment, expanded inspections, and restrictions on Iran's regional partners. Iran, meanwhile, must consider internal political realities, especially the influence of powerful institutions such as the Revolutionary Guard. This creates a difficult balance. Iran may negotiate while continuing military operations because Tehran views both actions as part of the same strategy. Military pressure strengthens diplomatic leverage. Diplomacy creates space to reduce military pressure. The key signal to watch will be the language coming from American officials. Political language often changes before policy changes. If officials move from saying Iran is not serious to saying Iran has taken meaningful steps toward meeting core objectives, that could indicate that Washington is preparing its audience for a compromise. The words will likely change before the strategy does. The second prediction concerns the possibility of increased pressure at Bab el-Mandeb and the wider Red Sea region. If Iran's strategy continues to focus on creating pressure through multiple geographic points, then the actions of the Houthis in Yemen will become a major factor to watch. The Red Sea route is not simply a regional issue. It is connected directly to global energy markets and international trade. Any serious disruption there can create consequences far beyond the Middle East. The Houthis have already demonstrated their ability to affect commercial shipping, and their actions create another layer of uncertainty for countries that depend on stable maritime routes. This is especially important because energy prices directly affect domestic politics. When fuel prices rise, governments often face immediate pressure from voters. Economic concerns can quickly transform into political problems. The timing matters. Political leaders do not operate in a vacuum. They operate around election cycles, public opinion trends, and economic conditions. Iran and its allies understand this reality. The signal to watch here is the behavior of major oil producers, especially Saudi Arabia. If Saudi Arabia begins changing production decisions, adjusting its public statements, or showing uncertainty about existing security arrangements, it could indicate that regional pressure is producing strategic consequences. The third prediction is that the United States may eventually declare a limited victory and begin a gradual process of de-escalation. This does not necessarily mean the United States will admit failure. History shows that governments rarely describe military campaigns in those terms. Instead, they often redefine objectives. A campaign that began with ambitious goals may later be described as successful because it achieved narrower objectives. The United States has several reasons to avoid a prolonged escalation. A ground invasion of Iran would be extremely difficult politically and militarily. A strike against the deepest underground facilities carries significant risks. Current operations require enormous resources. American intelligence assessments suggest the conflict remains unresolved. Domestic political pressure continues, and regional military bases remain vulnerable to retaliation. Under those conditions, a negotiated exit becomes more attractive. The likely path would not be presented as surrender or defeat. Instead, Washington could emphasize achievements such as damaging Iranian military infrastructure, reducing certain capabilities, protecting allies, and demonstrating American strength. Some of those statements may contain elements of truth, but they would also represent a political strategy, creating a narrative that allows leaders to step away from an expensive conflict without appearing defeated. The signals to watch are diplomatic rather than military. Look for quiet prisoner exchanges. Look for indirect meetings through countries such as Qatar or Pakistan. Look for changes in the language of international organizations. Look for announcements from third-party mediators suggesting progress. In many conflicts, secret diplomacy begins weeks before the public sees any official agreement. By the time a breakthrough is announced publicly, negotiations have usually been happening for much longer behind the scenes. Now, before finishing, there are several things everyone following this conflict should examine personally. First, Look at the intelligence assessments being reported about the conflict. Do not rely only on headlines. Read the details. The difference between a headline and the actual document often reveals the most important information. Second, examine Iran's formal statements to international organizations regarding attacks on its facilities. Look at the exact language being used. Diplomatic wording is rarely accidental. Every phrase is designed to create legal and political effects. Third, follow reports about Iran's missile capabilities. The key question is not whether Iran has suffered damage. It clearly has. The important question is whether that damage has fundamentally changed Iran's ability to continue military operations. Fourth, watch oil prices. This requires no special expertise. You do not need to be an investor. Simply observe what global markets are saying. Oil prices are one of the clearest indicators of how traders view risk in the Strait of Hormuz and surrounding areas. If prices fall significantly, it may suggest confidence that shipping risks are decreasing. If prices remain elevated, markets are signaling continued uncertainty. And that brings us to the central question of this entire conflict. After billions of dollars spent, after consecutive nights of airstrikes, after missile exchanges, after political pressure, and after intelligence assessments describing an unresolved situation, the reality is this: the United States has not achieved a complete military victory. Iran has not defeated the United States. Both sides understand the limits of their own positions. The United States has unmatched military power, but military power alone cannot guarantee political outcomes. Iran cannot defeat America in a conventional war, but it has built a strategy designed to make defeat extremely expensive. That is why the conflict continues. The system keeps moving. Military operations continue. Weapons continue to be used. Money continues to flow, and the cost continues to rise. So perhaps the most important question is not simply who is winning or who is losing. The deeper question is this: who benefits from a conflict that continues without a clear ending? And why is that actor rarely the one appearing in the headlines? Because throughout history, wars are often explained through the actions of governments, armies, and leaders. But behind every prolonged conflict, there are also systems, interests, and incentives that influence how long those conflicts continue. Understanding those forces is the key to understanding not only this war, but many conflicts that define our world. Thank you for watching. Stay informed, question every narrative, and continue examining the facts behind the headlines.